intent with this series is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. For many of us, you might sit in this space as sort of a spiritual disarranged person, right? You're frustrated, you're hurt. Maybe you experienced some tension in a space before where credibility in terms of church and leadership and what people were saying in that place, it just messed with you. Maybe you're coming from a place where you grew up and it gave you nothing. It felt meaningless and left you wanting on a good day, and maybe you weren't even sure what you were supposed to be longing for, but there was something else, but that place was not what was working for you. And so what we're trying to do in this series is, again, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and not for any reason to say somehow we've arrived. And we're not saying that infrastructure and systems don't matter, but what we are saying is this: can we learn to question what is going on in the other part of religiosity and take from it what works and let other parts of it go? For many of us, our assumption is that we often have to filter what we are experiencing based on other quote-unquote experts' opinion. They're the trained person, they're the expert, they're the one that went to the right school, they're the one that reads the right books, the right leadership posts. And so everything we feel, we often acquiesce and submit to that person's identity and the way in which they interpret you should experience faith in God, in community, and religiosity. And what we want to do in this space is speak to the idea that actually you might be more credible in terms of your own encounter with God than anybody else will ever be able to speak into that. I remember years ago working for 2 or 3 different organizations that held to a disposition that literally said women were in different posts had to submit to men, that men were dominant to women. And it wasn't just a sort of a cultural norm, it was literally taught as a theological ideal. I remember in those spaces not knowing what to do with it, but there was this internal dissonance. Something about that doesn't seem right. Something about that seems off. Something about that seems tainted, but I didn't necessarily have a category for it, nor developed enough even theology to play with something else. Or maybe you heard this growing up, that God was out to get you. Now, they would never articulate it quite that brutally, but that was what was communicated. That if you live up to God's expectations, and it really wasn't God's expectations, it was the expectations of that infrastructure. If you live up to the expectations of that infrastructure, then you and God are good. If you don't live up to those expectations, then you have hell to pay, figuratively and maybe literally. Have you ever sat with that kind of space? And I remember sitting with it in those days, thinking, I don't know what to do with that, but something doesn't sit right. There is this internal dissonance that is pushing up against that a little bit, but again, I didn't have language. Maybe I didn't have the intellectual prowess to sort of push up and say, no, there's something different. Or maybe I didn't even have a category. I had a young lady walking out here, a young couple that just showed up for the first time today. And they were walking out, and she was in tears as she's crying because for the first time she had a couple of words that helped articulate what she has felt her entire spiritual journey. And for many of us, that's all we need. We just need a new lexicon and a new language that articulates some of the things that and it begins to make sense, begins to come together. I remember for the longest time, the conversation related to the LGBTQ community. And what does that look like, and what do we do with that? And so much of, again, my background is saying there was something wrong and broken with that community, and only in this space, only in this community, only here at Watershed has it become a reality that no, there's actually, we're all the same. We all sit in this thing in the same space. And that the narrative that we often within spirituality, and maybe more specifically the church, go after different subcultures or segments of our communities, of our cities, is horrific at best and terribly wicked. And so when you ask me, what does it mean to experience organized religion versus disorganized religion, part of it is this narrative that the organized community, the organized spirituality puts forth, and you sit with that and you say, wait a minute, there's something about that internally that does not sit well, and I don't know what to do with it, and I don't even know what that means that it's not sitting well. But now at 48, I'm coming into a little bit of an awareness to what that means. I'm learning to put language to that voice, that I'm assuming there are many of you who are sitting in this space, and there are tapes playing in your head and in your mind and in your heart that says, man, I don't like what I often hear, whether it's turning the TV on, whether it's politics, whether it's the way you're seeing your family unravel, whether it's what you see at work, that there are these things inside of you that are pinging, and something about it is informing you, and it's as though you don't know how to listen to it, maybe because you don't have a language for it yet. So this morning I want to attempt to get at what some of that language might look like. So let me, if I may, sidebar. I want to take you down a little bit of a journey. If you've been through preface, we talk gently about this. We call it the three-person perspective of God. And most of us in this space have one or two of these categories in terms of how we identify, how we self-subscribe to who God is, or maybe more specifically, where they are. So God, for many of us, in the first perspective, is God is out there. God is somewhere out in the heavens. He's to be had, but the only way he is to be had is if somebody interprets as the perceived expert who God is and or what God might be saying. A lot of this worldview comes from something relatively ancient that said that there's a heaven and there's a hell and there's a middle ground, and earth is that middle ground, and God is out in the heavens, we are here, and that there's some kind of devil in the space of hell. And so we're constantly in the process of trying to figure out how to get more to there and less to the potential of a hell, right? And so many of us grew up in that culture, in that environment. And so we were not only trying to get away from not having to go to a hell, but we were longing to escape this space so that we could then be up there in the space that supposedly God is out there. That is a perspective of God. It's a very strong perspective. It's a very well-known perspective. Second perspective is that God is among us. Now, a lot of this has emerged from what we call kingdom theology, that in the last maybe 20 or 30 years that has been pretty prevalent. And this basically says that God is out with us. He's out in the space. He's sitting here with us. So what we do then is you still elicit a perceived expert to speak to what does it mean to tap God, because he's here. He's amongst us. So a small group leader might get training in how to facilitate. Okay, God's presence is here. Now how do we kind of take it on? How do we grab it? How do we have access with it? Or again, maybe another religious leader of sorts who has the proper training somehow interprets what's going on in the room and in the space. Again, to me, what I don't like about that is that leaves so much up to you to interpret what I'm experiencing. And then there's this third space, that God is in us space. Now, again, this all leaves us a little bit fuzzy and a little bit hard to sort of always understand, but because it's metaphor, because it's imagery, that's what I'm going to play with this morning. So this whole in narrative, there's an interesting dialogue here. And again, stay with me on this. I'm taking it somewhere. The idea that God is in us, I think, fits very beautifully and elegantly with the science that we currently live with. I'm not a quantum physicist by any stretch of the imagination, but I enjoy understanding, or at least playing with a little bit of it. And the quantum space basically addresses the subatomic narrative, the subatomic level. So atoms are things that we make bombs, we blow things up with. When we go below that, when we go to the smaller, more subversive part of the atom, you deal in the quantum space. And what science is telling us, and this is awesome, what science is telling us is that as you go lower and lower and you break down atoms more and more, you get less to physicality and you deal more with energy. That literally 99.999, a bunch of nines, % of you and I are energy. You probably already knew that, but if you begin to contemplate what it means to literally be energy, your physicality that you feel here is not your most ultimate reality. Our ultimate reality is that we literally are energy. If God is spirit, and God made us, and God is potentially in us, what does that begin to mean in terms of how we dovetail? Spirit, energy, you, I. I think Jesus speaks to this quite elegantly. I'm not sure he was aware of quantum physics. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure he wasn't. But John 17, there's this interesting conversation that's going on. Jesus is praying. He's talking to God. And he basically prays for and towards and about his 12 disciples. Then he turns the prayer towards the rest of humanity that would basically be us. And he says, Jesus says, as he's praying to God, my prayer is not for them alone, meaning not just for the disciples. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that they may be one of them. And he says, Father, for just as you are in me, I am in you. So there's this interesting dance there. And this is what most people hold to in terms of Trinitarian theology, but I think it's misrepresented in that space. I think there's something really profound here. Jesus says, I am in me, I am in you, and you are in me. So there's a deep connection here that Jesus is claiming with God. May they also be in us. May that's us here, you and I, the rest of humanity. May humanity be in us so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. So Jesus is saying something here, I think, pretty rich. He's basically saying, hey, God, the oneness that I have with you, I am invoking and I am articulating and I am assuming that same kind of oneness humankind has with you. What Jesus is literally saying, or at least my interpretation, which could be wildly jacked up and heretical on a good day, what Jesus seems to be saying here is this, that the oneness that you and I have, God, is the same oneness that humankind has with you. As a matter of fact, whatever I have with you, God, that is also what humankind has with you. Are you hearing what I'm saying? Like that you and I have access to God and connection with God and oneness with God literally like Jesus did. That's what Jesus was claiming here. And basically what he is saying is, wouldn't it be awesome if humankind could just be aware of that oneness, of that connection? I've given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I in them and you in me. He's basically saying this whole thing is all intertwined so that they may be brought to complete unity, to complete oneness. What we know in the quantum space is that literally if you ping and move a small subatomic piece here, thousands of miles away, it responds to that. The idea being oneness. The idea being connection. Some theologians / scientists argue that connection is spirit. That connection is way more beautiful and sort of metaphoric than it might be literal, although it's also literal, something to be played with. So I'm going somewhere. In all of this, when Jesus says, God, I'm one with you, God, and your creation is also one with you, when he's in essence saying that, some scholars go as far to say, not only are we one with God and are we in God. And let me just ask for this umbrella of grace as I make this statement, and don't shoot me, and I'm not sure where I sit with it, but I'm just going to say it. That some scholars argue that Jesus is implying not only are we one with God, but that we are God themselves. Because God has made all that is, and he only can create who he is. Now, I don't know if I believe it. It's probably wrong, but it's something to be played with. Because clearly, we should know that, right? We know that for sure. So here we sit, this space of being disorganized or organized. That organized religion is arguably saying you got to have a proverbial expert. You got to have somebody that's going to speak truth into this space because only they know, because they somehow are qualified. Whether self-proclaimed or whether the church proclaims unqualified or for whatever reasons. Disorganized religion decentralizes God. Basically, disorganized religion says we are one with God. We don't need necessarily all this infrastructure and all this system, because the oneness that we have with God can profoundly speak into who we are. So God is out there, we need an expert. If God is among us, we still need a little bit of an expert to be able to articulate what's going on in the room. But if God is in us, what in essence is happening is you become your own expert on your own journey, and what God speaks and does and says and pings in and through you has a sense of quality to it and legitimacy to it. Why? Because God might not be out there. I think Jesus is very clear in saying God is in here. So when you speak, when you engage, when you do something, when you do it from a space that is God in you, it might be even more profoundly informed. That what if we call this interior space an inner voice, an internal voice? What if we called an inner authority? So if I take the idea that God is in me and I have these internal sensations, this voice, that whatever is going on around me is good or bad, and that might be speaking to that this is right or wrong, or this is ideal, or this is healthy, then it could be these voices, not just crazy tapes in my head, that might be the voice of the divine. That when you have a pinging that says, wait a minute, this community is attacking a whole segment, a whole subculture of our community, of our city, something's not right about that. Wait a minute, God is out to get us, God is out to spank us, God is out to sort of judge us. That doesn't make sense, because why would the essence of the universe create something with which he wants to hurt? It fundamentally, intrinsically does not make sense. And when you sit with that and you say, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's an internal voice. That's this internal noise. It's speaking something that might be quite truthful, yet you've never allowed yourself the luxury to have that internal voice be credible. Somebody told you that you weren't credible, or somebody told you that your voice didn't mean anything, or when you went to share something, it was squelched. And so what do I mean by an inner voice? Again, this to me is much more metaphor than it is science. It's hard to obviously nail this down, but it's easy to speak to the general idea. But I think an inner voice can be your gut call, your intuition. When you feel like, I don't know what's going on, but there's this inner thing that is saying that whatever is happening here isn't right, or it's really good, and let's move forward with it. That maybe it's this God prompting or this feeling interior. And what does this inner voice even sound like for some of you? Or what is the inner voice even asking of many of you? Well, I don't know, maybe it's inviting you to start a nonprofit, or to bike across America, or to have a family, or to start a community like a Watershed. Or maybe the inner voice is telling you that everybody says you should be with this person, but they are really jacked up and you shouldn't be with this person. And you listen to your inner voice and you walk away and you're like, oh man, I escaped that crazy. Right? Like maybe for some of you, that's been your space. Maybe the inner voice is inviting you to rethink a career or a midlife pursuit. Well, it wouldn't make sense to let the 401k go because, my goodness, I still got 20 more years to go, but I'm already 20 years into this thing. And maybe the inner narrative is saying, but you're missing out on something so much more grand than the security of a retirement deal. And you listen to that voice and you move forward because that voice has credibility. Or maybe you have this inner voice. And I've heard so many of you tell me this. You don't use this language, but this is in essence what's happened. You found yourself in some kind of spiritual community somewhere else, and they were just beating the heck out of you with a baseball bat, or they were messing with you. You walk out of there brutalized and angry and hurt and embittered, and you just needed a community to kind of heal. And the salve that is this tribe came over you, and you felt like there's something here, that there's something sacred, there's something really profound. And the voice inside of you said at one point that you needed to leave that space. You might not define it as a voice, but now you look back, you began to realize it was so loud, it was so pronounced, and I was missing out. Because here at Watershed, your voice deeply matters. That what you get to experience here is something that when you speak from that space, we all benefit. That our inner voice, it frees us up to dream. This is one thing I've learned in this whole space. This past week, David, who you got a chance to hear a couple weeks ago, who did a killer job, by the way, when he spoke, and then Matt, our other co-pastor, and we were in Denver, Colorado this past week with 35 other church planters. These are people that get crap done. 85% of churches don't make it, don't work. So when you sit in a room with people who have done what we get to do here, and they've done it, and they do it really well, and they kind of coin themselves, and they use the word, they're a progressive community. I don't like that word progressive because it gives the persona that somehow we think we've arrived or that we think we're beyond somebody else. But I think it was the best descriptor. And in that space, everything was open for conversation. No matter what people talked about, it wasn't put down as like, wait, we can't go there. No, it was, wait a minute, and there's this underlying assumption that when you speak, you might be representing God on behalf of an experience that you're going through. And so you're speaking from a space of spirit. You're speaking from a space that God is informing, and so it's worth listening to. And so when you begin to dream, I wonder if God is saying and speaking through us and saying, let's try it, let's just go for it. That the infrastructure of somebody saying, no, you're crazy, no, you're wrong, you can't do that, is no longer at play. When now you're living with this voice inside, and it says that this voice actually might be credible. It might be worth something. When Matt and Donna, Taryn and I started this community, it wasn't done from a space of practicality. It wasn't because we wanted to make really high-end livings and have fancy cars. That's a joke for the record. It was out of a space of something else compelling us. Because we had jobs that were paying pretty decently, and we had good friends and good community where we were. And when we started this thing, we had the potential of losing all of that, everything. And now looking back on it, I can't imagine what it would have been like not to have listened to those internal sounds and that noise. It felt, now I look back and say, well, God's inviting us into this. And I look around the room and I see friends. I see community, people that we've known for 13, 14 years, and we are different because of those relationships that had we not listened to that noise or that voice, had we not allowed that voice to have credibility, we would have missed out on. And so the ability to understand how God is actually speaking in and through you is something that transforms, not maybe only the people around you, but it transforms you. That an inner voice, it levels the playing field. Here's what I mean by this. So my oldest son is a mountain bike racer dude with his high school, or with his middle school, and it's a really good experience there. Great families and kids involved. And so last Sunday we had a race somewhere up near Davidson. And one of the dads, he and I are standing around. I've gotten to know this father through the last couple seasons and really enjoy his company. And he's one of these people that's really a nice guy. Like, he actually inquires about my life and how, he'll often say, so how's Watershed? We'll have to dance back and forth. How's Watershed? And I say it's good. And he's sort of intrigued, but he's an atheist, and he doesn't really want to be here. So, and I'm okay with that. I get that. There's a lot of people who don't want to be here, so I get that. And they tell me, for the record. But this guy was inquiring, and we would sit there and we'd talk, and he's talking about I asked him, I said, so why are you an atheist? I had curiosity. And he shared with me. And like every atheist I know, they came from a church spiritual experience, and whatever it was, it threw them the other way. So I get that. And I looked him in the eye, and I called him by his name, and I said, I want you to know something. I'm not here to try to convince you to come to my community, come to my church. I think what we've got going on is amazing, but I'm not even trying to convince you or convert you, because in my previous role I would have tried to do that, but that's not even my agenda anymore. As a matter of, and I didn't say this part, but what my worldview about how I see humanity now is actually you have the indwelling of God themselves. And so if that's true, then when you speak and when you give voice to something, and then when you speak from a space of intimacy and courage internally and share that audibly, that actually it's something I should listen to because I have something to gain from that. That you contribute to who I am, that we are on the same page. I am not somehow more elevated because I hold to a deity and you don't. And maybe actually what I have to say can be credible to you because I'm not trying to impose that deity upon you. And so when we sit in a space like Watershed and you share your thoughts in a small group, and you begin to speak from your soul, you speak from this space, this inner voice, and you share about what's going on in your life or your perspective of something, that group benefits by you speaking forth, maybe, dare I say, the words God would want himself to say anyways. That group benefits, that tribe is better, that we as a group are better. We sit in preface and we hear so many of you share your thoughts about what your experience of faith and journey with God look like these days, and we sit there saying, wait a minute, I got something to learn. Matt and I and our staff and people that arguably have been in the faith space for a long time, we are not sort of beyond anybody. We sit here mutual, connected, level. It's a level playing field. And in that, we get to hear how God is speaking through each of us. This sense of oneness with God. That your inner voice, it extends to the idea of truth. Your inner voice is a version of truth, because your inner voice is fueled by spirit. Now, let me be real careful here. It's important to understand that we have to be in community in order sometimes to interpret what we're experiencing. Sometimes your inner voice might be helped or fueled by you being connected to other people who know you pretty well, who are able to also say, I've got this experience with God, and they interject their perspective. This past week, Matt and I were toying with the decision that we had to make, and I found myself with a lot of angst in it, and a lot of frustration, and a lot of tension, and I had this in my mind, very defined a way in which we needed to go after this situation. And after, if you know Matt, he's not one to talk a lot unless you suck it out of him. If you sit down with me, I talk too much. So Matt was being really quiet, and I realized, I might be speaking from a little bit of a jacked up space. I said, Matt, talk to me. The way I'm seeing this, is this right? What are your thoughts? And he, in his gracious way, said, no, you're messed up. And it was one of those, you're right, Matt. Wait a minute, I'm being way too dramatic. Yes, okay, I hear it. And it brought me back to a space that said maybe that space, that voice was a different tape. It wasn't this inner voice. Because relationship is a key filter for my inner voice to be real. You and I, many of us, all of us in here have false tapes we live with. That's not the inner voice I'm talking about. That's not the inner authority that we're talking about today. Many of us have these tapes that are playing that says things like, maybe a parent early on said things or did things that left you with a sound and a voice and a narrative that was so messed up. You're not smart, you're overweight, you're slow, you're dumb, you're not as good looking as your sibling, you're not as competent as somebody else. Maybe you're finding that in your adult space, that you graduated from college, you went to a good school and you found a job, and every day you go in there, you get beat up by some supervisor or some employer, and you're finding that there's a new noise that is playing in your head, and it's a tape, it's something that is messed up, it's something that is interpreting for you, not the voice that is God. And maybe what we get to do in the space of spirituality, in the space of church, is what we get to do is help you distinct and sort of separate those two worlds so that you begin to realize, wait a minute, that's a tape that is messed up, that is haunting me, that is not helping me. And when I speak from that tape, it hurts other people as well. I become manipulative, I become hurtful, I become resentful, and I'm speaking from a space that is not good. So what am I going to do? I'm going to jump in community where people can be honest with me, maybe go to therapy. I'm going to call that out. Then there's this other side that is the voice. This other side that is this inner authority. This other side that is my oneness with God that is speaking. And so maybe part of our spiritual pursuit, some of our spiritual journey is coming to this realization that I have to learn to separate the two. That you actually have a voice that is worth all of us in this community hearing. And then you also have these tapes that are playing that you are working at, that you are this person in process of trying to figure out, how do I learn to push those aside and allow this inner voice that is God, that is our oneness with Him, to be more prevalent, to be more pronounced. And so you begin to understand, maybe when we start talking about what does it mean to slow down? What does it mean to breathe? What does it mean to be reflective and pensive? What does it mean to pray? or meditate. Because in those quiet spaces, you're able to slow down enough and maybe begin to articulate what are tapes and what is this inner authority, this inner voice that God is infusing you with. And you have the ability to push these aside and begin to filter how you see life through those different noises. And you begin to wake up and you say, oh, okay, in this moment with God, I'm finding a sense of awareness that I never realized before. I'm more in tune with when I'm in my healthy space, this is what happens. When I'm in my dark space, this is what happens. And it's why the interior work, the interior life is so crucial to our journey. And so here's what I'm going to invite you into. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and just kind of sit in this space. I'm going to invite you to not get up, not leave, not think about lunch. Just like be here, be now. Push aside all the noise, all the chaos that is your week coming up. And I'm going to invite you to repeat something in your mind, quietly to yourself. I am not my body. I am not my ego. I am my soul. I am not my body. I am not my ego. I am my soul. The space of soul, this is your real reality. This is the real nature of who you are. This is your inner voice. This is your conscious space. And for a moment here, reflect upon the possibility that the tiny, silent little voice within you is real. Maybe it's more real than the physicality of your back against the seat and your feet on the floor. Maybe the tiny little voice that tries to prompt us, tries to guide us, and we often ignore it, but actually it's our highest reality, it's our highest self. It's the voice of God speaking in and through us. Listen very quietly and hear what your inner voice has to say. Hear the answer that it has for you. Hear the pursuit that maybe it's drawing you into, that the voice is of your soul. Focus all your attention on this and maybe continue to let other things go. Sit silent and focus your entire past, present, and future in this space and listen. Listen to your heart. Take the next couple moments and ask the question, what is your inner voice saying this morning? Father, maybe for some of us, this is the first time we've ever slowed down enough and just even posed the question. Maybe for some of us, it's the first time we've ever been vulnerable enough to inquire, is there another voice that I need to be listening to? Is there another voice that needs to be louder? And so God, I find myself humbled to be in this space, humbled to be with men and women and people who take seriously their pursuit of you. And whatever imagery or metaphor or story that we need so that we can bump into that even more intensely, Father, we welcome it. We look forward to the days ahead as we begin to maybe even ask different questions about who we are based on your possessing us. We say this often, Father. And we even use metaphor like dad and Father just because it fits well. We love you. Thank you for who you are. So that was part of it also I want to do, but there's a phrase that jumped off at me. I tried to take a picture of it here. It said, we've been liberated from our bondage of fear. With the sons and daughters, let us sing our song of freedom. That if the church and our faith with God and the voices that we hear are not freeing us, then we're in the wrong line of work. So for many of you in this space, I know you are in bondage to these tapes that are playing, and it's not the voice that God has instilled in us. It is a different voice. And so my prayer for you this week is a prayer for peace, is a prayer for a new waking up to a new voice that's been there maybe all along that you are hopefully going to discover. We're going to sing this song, and then Austin can finish in praying. We'll get out of here. But let's just sing these words, get lost in this. May this be a way that you get to fuel the voice that God is wanting us to express.